Hello, everyone. As part of our Better Outcomes webinar series, I'd like to thank you for joining us online today for this very special live broadcast. My name is Emily Eberly with Sachs Healthcare Communications, and I am your technical producer. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Beyond SIRS, Rethinking Sepsis Screening in the Hospital. And now, I'd like to introduce you to Nicole Kupchik, who is our moderator today. Nicole has practiced as a critical care nurse for over 20 years. About 15 years ago, she began working at Harborview Medical Center, a change that spurred an interest in resuscitation. Shortly thereafter, Nicole was part of a multidisciplinary team that was one of the first in the United States to implement therapeutic hyperthermia after cardiac arrest. As part of this effort, Nicole was responsible for protocol development and has published numerous papers on this topic. At Harborview, Nicole created and implemented a very successful sepsis program. In 2013, Nicole founded Nicole Kupchik Consulting. Nicole, welcome, and I'm so glad to be working with you for this special session, and we thank you for all of your support in moderating this important webinar for so many people today. Are you ready to get started?
I am, Emily. Well, good morning and afternoon to everyone out there. And thanks, Emily, for that nice introduction. The title of today's webinar is Beyond SIRS, Rethinking Sepsis Screening in the Hospital. Speaking today on this topic is a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Donna Edelson. Dr. Edelson is a hospitalist and researcher at the University of Chicago. She's also the founder and CEO of QuantHC, which is a health care technology startup company. She's a nationally recognized expert in the treatment and prevention of in-hospital cardiac arrest, and she's really focused on harnessing big data analytics and new technology to identify subtle changes in clinic stability in order to predict sepsis. Her work has been cited over 6,000 times and has been published in very high-profile journals such as JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine, and the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine. Dr. Edelson is the developer of an amazing program called eCART. Basically it's an electronic early warning system that uses vital signs, lab data, and demographics to automatically risk stratify hospitalized patients and alert clinicians in real time when a patient becomes high risk. And I'm just going to say you all are in for a huge treat. So we're going to talk about how you get continuing education. So this program's been approved for 1 contact hour for continuing education units for nurses and respiratory therapists. So at the end of the program, I'll show you the link that you can go to do an evaluation and get your CEs, and also will be sent to you. And then support for this educational activity has been provided by Philips, so we'd like to give them a huge thank you for doing so. So Dr. Edelson has the following disclosures. She's the owner and CEO of QuantHC, and she has gotten numerous research grants and support from the National Institute of Health, Philips, and Early Sense. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Dr. Donna Edelson. And again, the title of this webinar is Beyond SIRS, Rethinking Sepsis Screening in the Hospital.
Thanks, Nicole, for the very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here today and talk to everybody about this topic that I'm so passionate about. So the objectives for the talk are to be able to describe the pros and cons of various sepsis screening approaches in the hospital, particularly focused on the med-surg areas. Discuss how big data and real-time analytics are transforming the sepsis screening landscape. So, the third international consensus definitions came out recently, the SEP3, and defined sepsis as life-threatening organ dysfunction caused by dysregulated host response to infection. And that's a lot of big words with lots of syllables, but really I put it down into this Venn diagram. To me, and way I think about sepsis as the intersection between critically ill and infected. Certainly we know there are patients who are infected, who you can get an infected cut, for example. It's not a systemic infection. That's infected. Then you can be critically ill from something else. some other kind of cardiogenic shock, for example, critically ill but not infected. Sepsis is that intersection between those two places. And the reason why that's important and understanding is because when we're trying to find that intersection, we can come at it from two different directions. We can start looking at who's infected first and then decide which of those patients are critically ill, or we can start from who's critically ill and then decide who's infected. And they're real important considerations and ramifications depending on which approach we go, particularly in terms of efficiency and false alarms. And that's really where I want to spend a bunch of time on this talk today. So just to set up the background for you, sepsis is hugely expensive. It's why we're all so focused on it, because CMS cares about it, because it's the single most expensive thing that the U.S. healthcare system spends money on. There are 1.5 million cases of sepsis in the U.S. each year, with a mortality that ranges from 15 to 30%, and it costs the U.S. healthcare system alone $24 billion. That is an insane amount of money, and so with it, we get a lot of external emphasis on it, which is helpful then for us to drive the quality programs that we do. So that's the bad news on sepsis. The good news on sepsis, though, is it's also one of the most treatable things that we deal with in the hospital. There's tons and tons of data that antibiotics improve outcomes in sepsis, right? It's the one thing we know consistently that no one doubts, and not just giving the right antibiotics, but giving them in a timely manner. Consistently, we've seen that. This was the 2017 article in the New England Journal of Medicine showing this, but we have data going back decades showing the same relationship, that every hour we delay getting antibiotics to septic patients, their mortality goes up. There's less data and conflicting data about pretty much everything else we do in sepsis, debates about the fluid, debates about the monitoring, but everybody agrees that timely antibiotics saves lives and that we can move the needle in terms of sepsis mortality. That means, though, if we're going to do that, we have to find those patients, and we have to find them quickly and efficiently. And we cannot over-find them. I guess one approach would be just anybody who walks in the door, we put everybody on broad-spectrum antibiotics. Then if they're septic or become septic, we have them covered. But at the same time, we have issues with antibiotic resistance. So we have to get everybody the antibiotics quickly without overshooting. Hence, we run into the other into a longer-term problem that will cause problems for us. Now, the approaches to screening really vary depending on where you are. Most hospitals have a good program for screening in the ED, and it's pretty easy in the emergency department in terms of there's a clear time zero. They walk into triage, we take their vital signs, they either look SIRSy or not, and then if they look SIRSy, then the question is, do we suspect infection or not? And it's really, we have a nice, clear triage time zero. That is not the case in the hospital when patients don't present with sepsis. When they become septic later in the hospital, it is really much harder to find them because we don't have a system in place to do that well, and we have the added problem of we're used to them, so it's harder to recognize it, because it's like watching your kids get taller in front of you. For anybody who has kids, you notice that you don't see it, but then some relative or old friend who hasn't seen them in a long time shows up and notices that your kids are really tall. That's what happens to us in the hospital when we're caring for patients. We naturally adjust to subtle changes, and so we can miss big things. So the Surviving Sepsis campaign has recommended that we screen every patient, every shift, every day for sepsis when they're in the hospital. And that's both hugely ambitious and also leaves a ton of holes. That could mean that we're going 12 hours in between screens for patients, and so trying to get those antibiotics within the first hour is going to be really tricky. So, and we run the risk of lots of false alarms. But that's the best that's out there in general in terms of if you're looking at broad population thinking. And I'll say that most hospitals that I've worked with don't even do this well, because it's really hard to do. I will say almost every hospital I've been in has a really good and robust ED screening, sepsis screening program, but really struggles in this place. So that approach generally starts with who's infected, and that would be the CMS approach. The surviving sepsis approach really starts from that question of let's figure out who's infected, and then let's afterwards think about whether there's organ dysfunction. And I would say that's pretty standard. And so the question is, how do we go at that? And there's two components to it. So one is figuring out objectively, are there objective data to suggest it? And then there's also the subjective assessment. So I figured I would show you guys, this was a paper that we published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Hospital Medicine, looking at the question of suspicion of infection. How good are we at guessing when we do these screens? How do we do them? And so it's an interesting study. At the time we had a program at the University of Chicago where the nurses had completed a paper screening tool on every single patient, every day, every shift. Right? They were following the Surviving Sepsis campaign, and we had on this was we took one unit's worth of data, classic med-surg unit. We had 11,489 screens, and found that about a third of them were meeting SIRS criteria at the time of the screen, and that the team suspected. The nurse suspected infection in about a third of those patients who were SIRS positive. But then we did something interesting, which is look at whether the physician or the mid-level provider agreed with that nursing suspicion. And so the way we got at that is we said we had from the nurses whether or not they suspected new or worsening infection, and then we had, or actually if they suspected any infection, and we had from the orders, we knew whether anybody had ordered cultures or antibiotics. And we said if someone had ordered any culture or antibiotics, then the provider suspected infection, otherwise it was just the RN. And so what we saw in that was that there actually wasn't very much overlap between the two groups. The RN suspected infection in a lot more patients than the providers did, but there wasn't a ton of overlap. But when there was overlap, when both groups agreed, progression to septic shock and death was 2 to 3 times more likely. So then we did something else, which was to look at the timing. And so we looked specifically at those patients who went from the floor to the ICU with sepsis. So these are the patients who we knew progressed to severe sepsis or septic shock because they required a transfer to the ICU. And that's time 0 on here. So I'm going to move my cursor so you can see it. This is time 0. And if you look at the ordering providers, so the MD or the APPs, were the advanced practice providers. If you look out 48 hours before, less than 10% of the time did the provider suspect infection. These are cumulative, and the RNs were higher, and consistently they track higher the whole entire time. So in terms of timing, by 24 hours out, 25% of them had already been suspected by the clinical providers, where a third of the RNs had already suspected infection. And if you look at time 0, what's interesting, even right before, it's about a third. The physicians catch up to the nurses. They're about 18 hours behind when they finally catch up to them. And what's interesting is immediately, see how those 2 lines converge, that's the point where the physicians are finally agree with the nurses. So really, really interesting, and not terribly surprising, because the nurses are there in the hospital, and so they see it and they catch it before the docs do. And the fact that those two things aren't together suggests that there's probably a communication issue between the two. So that's the suspicion. But you know what else we saw in there is we tracked to see what makes the physician suspect infection. And if you look at, again, that time 0, that the orders for antibiotics and cultures track perfectly, almost up until the very end, with SIRS. So when the patients meet SIRS criteria is when the physicians tend to order antibiotics and cultures. So the nurses are picking up something else in their intuition, and the physicians were almost perfectly tracking that. So we looked now, we think a little bit more about SIRS. Here are the SIRS criteria. You guys are all probably super familiar with them, right? Heart rate greater than 90, temp greater than 38 or less than 36, the respiratory rate greater than 20, and white count greater than 12,000 or less than 4,000. And the adage is, if you're meeting 2 of these criteria, then you're at increased risk for sepsis. So let me just back up a little bit to give you a little history of where the SIRS criteria comes from. SIRS criteria comes, it's a couple decades old at this point, when we didn't have access to a bunch of data. And so what we did, what a bunch of clinicians did, we pulled, experts sat around a table and said, okay, well, what criteria should we put and what threshold should we use? Completely expert opinion driven, without any data science behind it. And it's actually remarkably good, given that. It was the best that they had back then, and it's really, really good in terms of picking up. If you're meeting 2 of these criteria, there's very, very high sensitivity for meeting SIRS, for being infected. The problem is that it's very not specific. So, for example, right now, I could have a slightly high heart rate and some tachypnea as I'm giving this talk. And I can assure you I'm not septic, but it could look like that. I certainly could be meeting SIRS criteria. And so we looked in the hospital to see how many patients meet SIRS criteria. And these are med-surg patients. If you look, on admission to the ward, so with their first set of vital signs, 15% of the patients are already meeting SIRS criteria, just on vital set 1. I'm going to move my cursor here so you can see it. By 48 hours, 50% of the patients on the wards have met SIRS criteria at least once. By the time they've been there a week, it's well over 80%. So everybody is going to meet SIRS criteria. If they haven't met it yet, they just haven't been there long enough. It's just not that hard to do that. And that's a real problem if you have a screening tool that depends on SIRS, because the number of false alarms that you have to contend with is enormous, and it's exhausting. It may be, and it's less of a big deal if you're talking about if you're in the ED where it's happening once. It's excruciating if you're talking about longitudinally taking care of patients where they're continually meeting SIRS criteria. So, for example, if you have an automatic alert set up in your EHR that's based on SIRS, it will go off constantly, because pretty much every time a patient gets up and goes to the bathroom, they're going to meet SIRS criteria. So, the alternative, which was postulated a couple years ago, group took a big, a well-renowned research group took a massive data set and said, well, let's do this from data instead of making it up, and let's figure out what the data tell us and come up with a score. And they came up with a qSOFA, the Quick Sepsis-Related Organ Failure Assessment, and got it down to 3 variables. If your systolic blood pressure is less than 100, if your mental status is altered, or if you're breathing at over 22 a minute. If you meet 2 of those criteria, you're at greater risk of a poor outcome. And it's way more specific than SIRS by a lot, which is great, the problem is it's also way less sensitive. And in fairness, just if I can take a crack at these guys, do we really need a tool? I think we've got real problems in a hospital if we need a tool to give to nurses to say, hey, if your patient's hypotensive and altered, you should be worried about them. We got way bigger fish to fry if folks don't know that. So this is almost too simple, but this is what but at least it's data driven. So there's some value at it. But let me contrast the two of these two general approaches. Right. Both of those actually seem to be both of those tend to focus, actually I'll get to it, both of those focus on the infection issue. I say, what if we go the other way and start with the critically ill focus, which is instead of thinking about who's infected first, what if we go at who's sick in the hospital, and then if they're sick, try and figure out if it's because they're infected or because something else is going on. And so if we were going to do that, instead of one of those tools like SIRS or qSOFA, both of which have huge limitations, which I just laid out, and I'll show you a little bit more later with data, we look for a tool that looks at critically ill. And so we have a couple options when we're in that space. So one is the modified early warning score. It's probably the most commonly used early warning score in the hospital. It's been around now since the 80s, or the first version of it was. It's been modified a couple times since, but certainly since the late 90s, folks have been using the modified early warning score. And it uses 5 different variables: your respiratory rate, your heart rate, systolic blood pressure, temperature, and mental status, and assigns a point value between 0 and 3 for based on the category of where you are, and you add all that together and you come up with a score overall of how sick you are. So you can see if everything's totally normal, you have a MEWS of 0. If all you have is a little bit of tachycardia and everything else is totally normal, you get 1 point. Usually folks, different hospitals do things differently. Some might use a threshold of greater than 3, some use a threshold of greater than 4. I've seen hospitals use a threshold of greater than 5. You can use many, many different thresholds for it. And just to contrast this with the other two, MEWS, also similar to SIRS, was derived by expert consensus opinion. Bunch of really, really talented clinicians got around a table, sat together and said, okay, what should we put in here and what threshold should we use? And you can actually tell that from the data. If you look at the respiratory rate, for example, they said 0 points if your respiratory rate is 9 to 14. And that's actually true, because if you were just going with true physiology, that would be the case. However, every hospital in America, I have yet to see one that does it any differently. Everybody seems to put their respiratory rates at either 16, 18, or 20. And I say, I don't know which hospital you're at. I personally am at an 18 hospital. Everybody's breathing at 18 all the time, but I've seen 20 hospitals and I've seen 16 hospitals. That's the default rate. And so you'd already be getting a point. Everybody would start with a MEWS of 1 if it was set that way. But otherwise, actually, it's pretty good. The group then, using out of the UK, a group took a big data set and said, okay, well, what if we were to qSOFA the SIRS and take these data points and derive with real data what the score ought to be? And so they came up with, this is the National Early Warning Score, and this is actually adopted across the UK. Everybody's expected to do this, and we've seen it's made its way to the US now. Not as many hospitals use the news as use the MEWS, but honestly, it's better. So anyone who has the option, if you're using MEWS, you're better off with news, because it's actually data driven. So instead of the 5 variables, they have 7 variables. So adds the oxygen saturation and the supplemental O2 get added to it, and you can see now that it's data driven because because you see you're getting zero points now for 12 to 20, and see how heavily weighted respiratory rate is. That's all data, because respiratory rate is hands down the strongest predictor. And temperature, for example, is actually not that strong a predictor unless it's really low. It turns out that hypothermia from the data is way more predictive than hyperthermia is for clinical deterioration, and the data will bear that out as well. So, so significantly better, again, because it's data driven. Let me see if I can get my, okay, so catching up to, all right, so now what happens when we compare these two approaches? One, go with the sepsis tool. The other is start with an early warning score and figure out which one is better. And so this was a study that we published as well, and I'll take you through it a little bit. So if in this study we compared, this was right after news came out, we compared MEWS and NEWS to SIRS and qSOFA. And this is the data from the floor, but from the med-surg units, but it was similar in the ED as well. If you're looking at the area under the curve for predicting adverse events, NEWS is better than MEWS, which is better than qSOFA, which is better than SIRS. So SIRS is hands down the absolute worst way to predict adverse events in septic patients. It just is. And both of the general early warning scores do better than the two sepsis-specific tools. So given that, if you think about this, we actually dug in just a little bit more to get a better sense, and so that you can see the timing of this. So here's comparing time 0 is when the patients actually moved to became septic such that they went to the ICU. So time 0, ICU transfer time. If you look at when the patients first meet SIRS, qSOFA, or NEWS greater than 7, which would be the red threshold, the high-risk threshold, here's what you see. So SIRS, I told you, is the most sensitive. So at the time that they move to the ICU, 90% of them have met SIRS criteria, whereas just over 50% have met qSOFA criteria. So we're talking severe, these are patients who have severe sepsis or septic shock such that they required transfer to an ICU at a tertiary care hospital, where I can assure you that we leave some really, really, really sick patients on the floor. So they required transfer, and this is a actually we did this in a multi-center study, so five different hospitals, but lots of really high acuity. So at that moment where they're getting transferred to the ICU, we're still at just over 50% have met qSOFA criteria. So again, not very sensitive. Very, very sensitive on SIRS. And if you look at the timing, if you look at when 50% of the patients had met that criteria, so they meet SIRS criteria 18 hours before. They meet NEWS greater than 7, 12 hours before. And they meet the qSOFA criteria 6 hours before. So the sensitivity, it's both just the percent that they get to, but also the time that they get to it with. So that's if you're comparing those straight up. NEWS ends up being a midpoint between the SIRS and the qSOFA in terms of balancing that sensitivity and also the specificity. And this is really interesting, too. If you actually look at the NEWS, qSOFA is actually inside NEWS. So when you use NEWS, qSOFA is baked in, plus you add all these additional things into it. It's why it's better, and not terribly surprising, but interesting. So here's another way to look at this. So if I plot the sensitivity against 1 minus the specificity, so your false positives against your true positives, SIRS, I told you, is very sensitive, high sensitivity, low specificity. So it ends up here. That's a bad choice. You talk about having to choose between those two. I don't know. I really like high sensitivity, but I really, really hate false alarms. So So SIRS favors not missing anyone at the cost of a lot of false alarms. qSOFA goes the other approach, which is minimizes false alarms, very, very low on the false alarm rate, but also low on the sensitivity. So it's going to miss a lot of patients. And if you have to choose between those two options, you're really kind of in a bad place. I don't really want either of those options. Both of those trade-offs are unacceptable to me. So that if, on the other hand, you use an early warning score, what you end up with is more of a smooth curve, right? Instead of just having a dichotomous choice, SIRS has, you either meet SIRS criteria or you don't. It's dichotomous. Same with qSOFA. You either meet qSOFA criteria or you don't. Whereas when you take an early warning score, there are multiple different points. I talked about MEWS, for example. You can use a cutoff of 3, you can use a cutoff of 4, you can use a cutoff of 5, and you could actually do different things. So I like to use early warning scores with 2 cutoffs. I think of a moderate risk, and then I think of a high risk. And we think of doing different things at those 2 different places. In my world, the moderate risk, the yellow, I think of that as a floor nurse base and a primary team focus intervention. I've got plenty of time, often 20, 30 hours before the deterioration is going to happen. That's when I want to make sure I'm screening for sepsis and that everyone's paying a little bit more attention. The nurses and the physicians are talking to each other. The pharmacist is running the meds. Lots of good care where we can do a little bit more focus on those patients. The high risk, that's where I want a little more. I want to make sure that I get a critical care evaluation. So someone who's a little bit better trained at looking for deterioration just shows up to give me a second opinion. And so you would set your thresholds based on what your system can tolerate. So that's the basic idea. And honestly, you can move your dots anywhere on that line that you want, and you're trading off sensitivity for specificity each time. Now, that's just the basic concept of the general early warning score. But then you start to think about, well, which tool? So that's the basic concept for whether you're using MEWS or NEWS or anything else, any type of early warning score. But when we talk about switching from MEWS to NEWS or something even better, what ends up happening is you're talking about pushing out the whole curve. That a tool that has a higher overall area under the curve pushes the whole curve out and then makes your trade-offs less painful. And so that's really the space that I have spent the last decade of my life in, which is how do we take data and new high-powered analytics and statistics and push our curve out better such that we have better tools so we're not forced to choose between 2 bad options. So this has been, like I said, a decade of research, many publications in the space and lots of high-profile journals, easy to find if you're looking for them. The algorithm that we use and that we've spent most of our time working on, it's called eCART. It's the Electronic Cardiac Arrest Risk Triage Score. It's a machine learning analytic, uses 33 variables from the EHR, vital signs, labs, demographics. We derived and validated in a population of about 270,000 patients from 5 different hospitals. That was a nice mix of tertiary care, suburban, and urban, totally teaching, and community non-teaching hospitals. And the beauty of that is that we got a really nice mix of patients in there. And the model, unlike the MEWS and NEWS where I can write it out for you really easily and you can calculate it in your head, you cannot do that with eCART. It's a computerized algorithm. It has to be run in a high-powered computer that can do that. But what it can't, so I can't show you the model, what I can do is show you the variable importance plot and say what are the drivers of it. And so this is what a variable importance plot looks like for a machine learning analytic. It says if the strongest predictor, which I showed you, which you actually saw in the news, is respiratory rate. So if you normalize that to be 100, then heart rate is the second most predictive, and it's 77% the weight that respiratory rate has. Age is the third strongest predictor, followed by blood pressure, and then you get into temperature. Now, what's interesting is, so those are all your top predictors. BUN turns out to be the strongest predictor, and I'll move my mouse in case you guys can't see it. Apologies for the small text on this one. Hands down, BUN is the strongest predictor. I had no idea. I knew respiratory rate was going to come in high. I wasn't expecting BUN to be the strongest predictor, although, and again, I don't get to make this up. This is the data telling the story, and that's the beauty of statistics, is it doesn't have that same bias that we introduce as humans when we sit around the table and decide what should or shouldn't be in there. So BUN is actually a stronger predictor, although not that much stronger than white count, but it is. Glucose, and both of those are stronger predictors than oxygen saturation. So you can see, in general, vital signs are the stronger predictors, followed by the labs. And also whether or not the patient's been in the ICU before. And the other interesting thing is anion gap, which we use as a proxy for lactate, isn't at that top of the list in terms of the predictive power. Again, really, really interesting to me. So that's the stuff that goes into the model. But now we have to test it against those other tools. And so here's how we went about doing that. We had to figure out from these massive data, so from this data set that has hundreds of thousands of patients in it, where we can't actually go in and open every single chart and see who's infected, right? It's not practical when you're dealing with big data. You have to come up with a way to be able to do this from electronic data. And so we have to figure out suspicion of infection. And so there are a few different ways where we could define suspicion of infection. And again, we sat around the table and argued about what we would define as suspicion. We said, so you could say if a clinician orders any culture, is that suspicion of infection? Or does it have to be a blood culture? Or does it have to be a culture and antibiotics? Or does it have to be a blood culture and antibiotics? Or does it have to be a culture and 4 days of antibiotics? Certainly everybody agrees. I have yet to find someone who argues that if a clinician ordered a blood culture and the patient then got 4 days of antibiotics, certainly everybody would agree that somebody suspected infection. People will disagree about cultures because you could be ordering surveillance cultures. Sometimes it's certainly possible. But here there are lots of different ways we could define it. And so we wanted to know, is that going to bias our results at all based on it? And so if you look at those different definitions, as you go down the list, the ones to the right, this blood culture and 4 days of antibiotics, it's much more specific, again, less sensitive. But if somebody suspected infection, the mortality for those patients is over 9%. It's 3 times that of the ones where you use any culture. So there's a difference in terms of outcome, for sure, for mortality in terms of the definition. What's interesting about it, though, is that there's actually no difference in terms of or minimal difference in terms of its ability to predict, of the tool that you use to predict adverse outcomes. And so here we looked at the difference between SIRS, qSOFA, MEWS, NEWS, and eCART in predicting adverse outcomes in patients in whom suspicion of infection was who met suspicion of infection using all 6 of those different criteria. And it turns out it actually doesn't matter which criteria we use. Hands down, eCART outperforms NEWS, which outperforms MEWS, which outperforms qSOFA, which outperforms SIRS. So once again, I come down to SIRS is hands down the worst way to identify your infected, your septic patients in the hospital. Hands down the worst way. any of the early warning scores are going to be better. MEWS, NEWS, eCART. And there are lots of others you can use, certainly. But the whole point is that the better the tool, the higher the AUC, the better it's going to perform overall. And so that means that trade-off between your sensitivity and your false positives is going to be lower. So that said, armed with that, we had to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to operationalize this in the hospital? So here's how eCART works for us in the hospital. We're pulling data from the EHR, from the lab system. Administrative data is coming from ADT. It comes in real time through a system, goes to a cloud where we're calculating the eCART score, which is the probability that a patient's going to go to the ICU, have a cardiac arrest, or die in the next 8 hours. And from that probability, we can sort patients, we can categorize them as high risk, moderate risk, or average risk. That looks like this. We actually embed it inside the EHR. So here's a mocked up EHR because I can't actually show you a screenshot of a real EHR. But it looks something like this where you're inside the EHR, but actually they're seeing the eCART trend over time in there. They can mouse over it and they can see the actual predicted probability of deterioration. So we will say this patient's odds of going to the ICU, having cardiac arrest, or dying are 1 in 24. In the next 8 hours. They can see what variables are driving it at that moment, and as they mouse over it, all of these will change. They can have put in comments and see an activity feed, almost like a Twitter feed on these higher risk patients. But the coolest thing that we now allow them to do, because it's one thing to predict, it's a whole different thing to be able to drive workflow. And so we can predict and say, okay, this patient is now yellow or red, and that's the patient we want you to screen for sepsis, right? And run down a whole screen. So you can't see this, it's pretty small, but they click on the pathway. If they are a nurse, they might click on a physician pathway, but say the floor nurse sees that the patient's yellow, they click on this pathway right there, and that opens, again, inside here, a clinical pathway that they can run down that prompts them to go to look at the patient, reassess them, put in new vital signs. When they do that, it updates the score in real time automatically. And now they start to run down the pathway and think, okay, well, if the patient is already on antibiotics, then I know that somebody already suspected infection, and I actually don't need to know if the nurse suspects infection or not. What I really need to know at that point is the nurse worried about the patient? Because if the nurse's spidey sense is going off and the nurse is worried, well, then I need that nurse to activate the rapid response team. If they're not worried and the patient's already on antibiotics and they know everything's okay, fine, continue present management, we're good. And if they're not sure, this pathway would prompt them to talk to the doc. If, on the other hand, they go down the pathway and the patient is not already on antibiotics, well, then we ask them a bunch of pointed screening questions. Are there any signs or symptoms? And go through all the organ systems and have them, is there any warmth, redness? Is there a fever? Is there pus coming out of some orifice? Are they immunocompromised? All of those sorts of questions that you would want them to think about on a checklist to then help them answer the question, do they think infection is likely? Because if the patient's not on antibiotics, they think infection is likely, well, then we can drive them down a nurse-driven sepsis protocol where they can order a lactate without the physician, and they can do that right in here. We give them a link to make the order without having to go anyplace else. And so the whole point is predict and now drive clinical workflow. So here, I think, the big issue I have with that surviving sepsis goal of screening every patient every shift is it takes a one-size-fits-all approach to patients, and our patients are not one-size-fits-all. And so what ends up happening is we're splitting the baby. We're screening too many patients and too infrequently. The better approach, as far as I'm concerned, is to risk stratify the patients first based on how sick they are. If they're average risk, I actually don't think we want to be screening those patients. We're going to end up with way too many false alarms, and it's not efficient. When they hit the moderate risk threshold, whatever that is, regardless what tool you're using, whatever early warning score you use, when they hit that moderate risk threshold, so if that's a MEWS of 3 or a NEWS of 5 or an eCART of 93, that's when go see the patient, think about whether we need increased vital sign assessment, screen that patient for sepsis. But honestly, at that point, I don't think every 12 hours is enough. I want those patients reassessed at a minimum of every 4 hours. And so it's way, way fewer patients, but those patients get screened more often. When they hit red, that high risk threshold, again, whatever it is, whether it's a MEWS of 5 or a NEWS of 7 or an eCART of 97, it truly doesn't matter. You can pick it. That's when you want a more pointed and higher acuity intervention. Activate your rapid response team and do a proper sepsis evaluation. So this is the general idea, which is let's rethink this and start with who's sick first. If they're not sick, we don't actually care that much. I mean, we care about a whole bunch of other things, but we're not worried about a sepsis in patients who aren't sick. If they're sick, we need to figure out why they're sick. And it may be that they're infected, but it also may be that they have something else really bad going on too. They may be in cardiogenic shock. They may have a massive PE. There are lots of other things that could cause them to be critically ill, none of which we want to miss. And so that's my advocacy. Think about who's sick first, and then if they're sick, worry about who's infected. So I'll end with the following summary and then hand it back to Nicole, which is, SIRS is sensitive but not specific. When you use it, you're going to end up with a high number of false alerts. qSOFA is specific, but it's not sensitive. When you use that solely, you end up with you're going to miss a lot of cases, or you're going to be really delayed in following them. Your general early warning scores outperform SIRS and qSOFA. So MEWS and NEWS are more efficient screening tools. If you're using them right now, you probably don't also need to be using SIRS or qSOFA. But the future is really these machine learning early warning scores that are even better. And that's, I think, where ultimately we'll be going. So I'm going to hand it back to Nicole, our trusty moderator.
Wow, that was an amazing presentation, Dr. Edelson. And the questions have been flying in, so keep your questions coming. We'll try to get as many of them answered as we can. But just a reminder, we've got continuing education credits for nurses and respiratory therapists. This has been approved for 1 contact hour. Be sure to go to saxtesting.com/BO to fill out your evaluation. And then once you do that, you can print your CE certificate. So be sure to go to saxtesting.com/BO. And then again, we want to thank Philips for providing support for this educational opportunity. All right, Dr. Edelson, the questions have been rolling in. Are you ready?
Bring it.
All right. There's really good questions. Okay, so I'll start with I'm going to build on some of these questions. What does eCART stand for? Margaret wants to know.
eCART is the electronic cardiac arrest risk triage score.
Okay. So this tool was initially created to identify cardiac arrest. So one of the questions we got was, how predictive is it for accurately identifying sepsis? Was there an area under the curve that you can share?
So that's a great question. It was designed to predict. The outcome that it's trained on is cardiac arrest, ICU transfer, or death. So it's named the electronic cardiac arrest risk triage tool. It's left over. The story behind it is actually, I wanted to call it the CRUMP index, the Chicago Rating for Unstable Medical Patients, a decade ago. That was the plan, and my IRB said no, that was unacceptable, and I had to rename it something else because they thought that would be offensive. So we came up with eCART instead. But it's probably a little bit of a misnomer. So we're going for all forms of clinical deterioration. And you saw those AUCs. Those were the AUCs that I showed you in terms of the sepsis. That when we were again, it's significant. eCART's significantly better for sepsis than NEWS, MEWS, qSOFA, and SIRS.
Yeah, I'm just going to put in my 2 cents here. I think the CRUMP index would have been fabulous. I think they need to have a sense of humor. All right.
You needed to be on my IRB.
I would have loved to have been. Oh my gosh. Come on, you got to, I mean, but it makes sense. That's what we clinically, I mean, not clinically, but it's, a slang term we use all the time. Your patient's crumping. All right, so here's a great question. Susan and Carmen both want to know, can eCART be used for pediatric and neonates?
So no, not we. I actually haven't validated it in kids at all. We haven't done that analysis, but it was trained on patients who are older than 18. We have in development a pediatric version, and so hope to roll that soon. I personally would not use it on a pediatric population because it just wasn't developed in that population.
Okay, that makes sense. And then and so you're actively validating a pediatric version now?
Yes.
You said? Okay, great.
Pediatric pills are they're harder to do just because the ends are so much lower on the pediatric side, and so and because age is such a major confounder, you need an even bigger data set. So it takes years, way more years to get to the kind of data set, the size of the data set that we use on the adult side. But we actually have a large data set right now. We're really excited about it, and have some early version, and which we hope to roll out soon.
Okay, I love it. And then a couple questions specifically about eCART. This one is from Narina, and she wants to know what's the cost for eCART.
Oh, great question. And I mean, anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards, I'm happy to do it. It gets charged at the level of the patients. It's about somewhere in the order of $1 to $2 per patient per day. It really depends on the volume that we're talking about, the size of the hospital. But please email me after, and I'm happy to talk to anybody in more detail.
Yeah, I'm just going to say I think it would be priceless. So, I mean, truly, I've worked with code blue teams and rapid response teams, and this is the big stickler in hospitals is early identification of deterioration. It's a huge problem. Okay, here's another question. Would eCART be categorized the same as kind of the buzz term right now, AI, artificial intelligence? What do you think about that?
Yes, it would. It is definitely AI. It's a term I try to avoid because it makes some people anxious.
I like it. Yeah.
Particularly, it makes doctors anxious more so than it makes nurses anxious. I've had doctors ask after I present the work without saying the word. They'll come up to me afterwards and say, "You're going to make doctors obsolete." I said, I am a doctor. That wasn't my plan to make doctors obsolete. It's interesting. The nurses never think they're going to be obsolete because they're not.
Yeah.
But does AI? It's true that AI does should make physicians more efficient. My goal isn't to replace anybody. The goal is honestly to just make them more efficient. When I come in as a hospitalist, if I'm covering 50 patients at night that I don't know at all, it's a completely different experience to walk into a hospital and be able to see all of those patients sorted from highest risk to lowest risk and know that I'm going to get a page when a patient turns red or yellow than to walk in blindly and just wait and hope that someone calls me and lets me know when they're sick.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and I just think it helps you prioritize care on patients. Okay, let's see. Which EHRs can be used with eCART? Amy would like to know this question. Or this answer.
So that's a great question. The answer is the fully embedded two-way integration runs easily in Epic and Cerner. It can we can run it on any EHR. So eCART can run on absolutely any EHR, but it runs the best on Epic and Cerner. And probably has some of the capabilities that we can do in Epic and Cerner we could do in some of the other EHRs except for Meditech. If you're on Meditech, we can run it in Meditech, but it's one-way integration. Doesn't have the order entry.
Okay. So here's another great question. Do you think there is any place in the hospital, maybe the ED or triage for qSOFA?
I don't, actually. I don't know why you would want to use qSOFA over new. I don't know why you would want to use SIRS or qSOFA. right now, all the EHRs can do MEWS, and I think they can almost all do news too. So right now, today, if you have an EHR, without spending any additional money, you ought to be able to run news. That would be my default. I would start from there. If you have the resources to go above and beyond, and you want to be using some kind of AI with fully embedded integration, then those are better, and I think it's worth looking into that. But right now, I would toss qSOFA for sure. I don't see the utility over news.
Okay. So just so you know, we've gotten a lot of comments. People like the Crump Index score, the name of it.
Thank you.
I like that. Okay, let's see. What about, have you heard about, Julie would like to know if you've heard about News 2, and if you have, what your thoughts are about that.
Are we talking about the tweaked version? So the UK folks did do a tweaked version of it, and I haven't personally studied it in my own data set, so I can't really speak to it intelligently, but I can say that that I trust the scientists who did it, so I would believe their studies. They wouldn't switch it unless it's it's slightly better.
Okay. Okay, here's another question. What are the limitations of lactate in this patient population? So basically, are there any limitations of lactate? Because sometimes you have a patient who looks sick and you get a lactate and it looks normal. Other ones that can be obnoxiously high. Is there anything you would comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So lactate is really, really predictive. It's a great tool, but it's not a perfect tool. It's the bigger problem with the lactate are the false positives. So the asthmatic patients that have those guys get you a lot. And the patients that are difficult sticks, where someone had a tourniquet on them too long, or somebody didn't, or they let the blood sit there too long. It sat in. I don't know if you're in a hospital that uses a tubing station, or people are just really slow at getting it down. You get a lot of false alarms. So it's more. You get false elevations more commonly than you do with other tests. That said, used in the right context, it's a really important and valuable tool. So I would I'm a strong proponent of using an appropriate screening tool to figure out who should get the lactate. So they need to be high risk, and then someone needs to suspect infection in them. And if they meet both of those two criteria, so high or moderate risk, whatever it is, whatever tool you're using to figure out who's sick, and then if you think that it's a new or worsening infection, then there's absolute validity in ordering the lactate. But and if it's negative, you can generally feel pretty good about it. If it's positive, it's you definitely want to repeat it.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so here's the next question. What do you think about using eCART in immunocompromised or oncology patients? And that's from Emily.
So we had a large number of those types of patients in the population that it was derived and validated on, so we absolutely use it in that patient population. But still, as part of the screening tool, so the first is to do the predictive analytic, but then if they're higher risk and they're not on antibiotics, that should prompt them down a whole different part of the pathway that takes you. Immunocompromised patients need a little bit more. But yeah, absolutely, we use it in that patient population.
Okay, and then here's another question, just asking about the OB patient population.
Yeah, we get that question a lot. So postpartum, no problem. We use eCART on those patients. In fact, some of my best saves ever were in that patient population. We actually had a 21-year-old woman who was day 2 after a normal C-section, was totally fine on the postpartum unit with her baby, and eCART triggered as red. The rapid response team they got an automatic page, and they went down to go see him, thinking this was going to be a false alarm, because they thought that the rapid response team never goes to the postpartum unit, because their patients generally don't tend to be sick over there. But she gets down to that unit and looks at the patient, and she's saying she's short of breath, and she can't get the pulse ox to pick up. So she puts her on a non-rebreather face mask and orders an ABG, and her PaO2 is 55 on a non-rebreather face mask. Terrible.
Whoa. Huh.
So I mean, Nicole, you probably have more experience with this. Like, how many minutes away from a cardiac arrest do you think that is?
I mean, you're heading right down that pathway. But I mean, the thing is, they probably wouldn't have noticed her for a long, 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 long time. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. You almost worry that one they wouldn't have even found the cardiac arrest. Like, that's one where they almost come in afterwards and
when she's arresting.
Cold.
Yeah.
Cold.
Oh
yeah.
Gosh, that's awful. I mean, good, but yeah.
It was a great save, but it was a terrifying save.
Sure.
They got her. They put her on. They got her on BiPAP. They ordered a chest X-ray. She had flash pulmonary edema. She had blown mitral valve, which she probably had. She probably had a bad mitral valve the whole time, and they never knew. It was just when she was mobilizing all that fluid. But they got her on BiPAP, got her to the ICU, diuresed her. She got a brand new valve. She went home a week later with her baby. She was probably 10, 20 minutes away from arrest. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. Wow. Okay. Here's another question. Go ahead. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
So in the postpartum, absolutely. In the laboring moms, that's another place where we're working on a separate tool, because the physiology there is really different, and it would go off all the time because everyone's tachycardic and tachypnic over there, and since those are the strongest predictors, everybody would be red who's laboring, and so we're working on a separate tool for that. I do not use it in laboring moms.
Okay, that completely makes sense, though. Okay. So do you think that BUN ended up being one of your strongest lab indicators or predictors because of dehydration?
Yeah, I actually do. I think that's very likely that's it's one of the predictors that because it's an early indicator of AKI, which and so of hypovolemia in general. And so yes. I do, and it's also consistent with the pancreatitis literature, that it always used BUN in there. So when we went back to try and make more sense of it, it made sense. It just wasn't what I would have guessed going in.
Okay.
I would have thought the anion gap would have been the strongest predictor, and I was wrong.
Okay. Well, this is why we study things, right? So I've got a number of people requesting information on how to get in touch with you.
Oh, yes, it's they can email me at Dana, DANA, at quanthc.com. And actually, you know what, I see it right now. Somebody did Emily put it in the chat window. So if everyone can see it, that's my email address.
Okay, awesome. So I think we got to most of the questions. There were a lot of repeat questions. I think we really answered most of them. This was an amazing presentation. I have to say, the work you have done, Donna, I think is going to save lives, and it's absolutely revolutionary. I'm so just impressed by the work you've done.
Well, thank you so much. And but I will, just to keep everybody in check, all what we're doing is predictive. A predictive algorithm will never save anybody's life. It's the people on the front line who do the saving. So my goal is to get that information to people in an efficient way so that the front line can do what they do best, which is save these people's lives.
Yeah, well, that's a great perspective. So, okay, everyone, we're going to conclude this webinar. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining this webinar. Have an amazing day.
Thank you so much, both Donna and Nicole, for this fantastic presentation today. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you, our guests in the live audience today, as well as those of you in a future time who are attending this recorded session. We thank you for your time and your thoughtful attention. And now this does conclude our session for today. Take care, everyone, and bye for now. We'll see you again next time.